Welcome. In this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most practical and powerful parts of design thinking: prototypes, testing, and iteration. And at first, that may sound like the part where things become technical, right? Maybe even mechanical. Build something, test it, fix it, and move on. But actually, this part of the process is deeply human, because it is really about one thing: learning. It is about how we learn what works, what does not work, what people understand, what they misunderstand, and what assumptions we need to let go of before we invest too much in the wrong idea. And that is why this episode matters, because many teams, organizations, and projects still fall into the same trap. They spend a long time discussing ideas, refining ideas, protecting ideas, and becoming emotionally attached to ideas before anyone outside the team has really had a chance to interact with them. And when that happens, something dangerous begins to grow. Confidence without evidence. The team starts to feel that the idea is strong because it has been discussed so much, because it sounds logical, because it looks good on paper, because everyone in the room understands it. But the problem is that the room is not the real world. Users are not the team. Communities are not the planning meeting. Reality is not the slide deck. And that is exactly why prototypes matter. They take an idea out of discussion and put it into contact with reality, not in a final, polished, expensive way, but in a small, focused, testable way. And that is the key thing to understand from the very beginning. A prototype is not mainly a small version of the final thing. A prototype is a way of asking a question. That is a very useful way to think about it. A prototype is a question made visible. Will people understand this? Will this process make sense? Will this language help or confuse? Will this support the need we think it supports? Will this idea fit real behavior or only ideal behavior? When you look at prototyping that way, it becomes much more interesting, because then a prototype is not just a draft. It is an instrument for learning. And that changes the whole mindset. A lot of people hear the word prototype and imagine something close to a finished product. They imagine a polished mock-up, a beautiful app demo, a clickable interface, or a professional model that looks almost ready for launch. And yes, prototypes can sometimes be detailed. But in design thinking, especially early on, prototypes are often much simpler than people expect. A sketch on paper can be a prototype. A role play can be a prototype. A rewritten form can be a prototype. A storyboard can be a prototype. A rough service flow can be a prototype. A conversation script can be a prototype. A pretend check-in desk made from paper signs can be a prototype. The form does not matter as much as the purpose. And the purpose is not to impress. The purpose is to learn. That is why roughness can actually be a strength. A rough prototype says, "This is still open." It invites response. It invites criticism. It makes it easier for people to say, "I do not get this," or "This part is confusing," or "I would never use it this way." And that kind of response is valuable. In fact, it is exactly what we want. Because what teams often fear in early design is what they most need: evidence that the idea is incomplete. If you only test ideas after they are polished, you create two problems. First, you delay learning. Second, you make change harder. The more polished something becomes, the more attached people become to it. Time has been invested. Energy has been invested. Identity has been invested. And when that happens, feedback starts to feel personal. Instead of saying, great, now we know more, the team starts to think, but we worked so hard on this. That is one reason early roughness is so powerful. It protects learning. It keeps the design flexible. It reduces the cost of being wrong. And in uncertain situations, that matters a lot, because design thinking is not based on the fantasy that we can figure everything out in advance. It is based on the reality that we often cannot. Sometimes we are dealing with unclear needs. Sometimes we are dealing with complex systems. Sometimes we are dealing with human behavior that does not follow our assumptions. Sometimes we are dealing with services, communities, or organizations where people experience the same situation in very different ways. In those settings, planning alone is not enough. Talking alone is not enough. Even expertise alone is not enough. At some point, we need interaction. We need to put an idea in front of real people and see what happens. And that is where prototypes become powerful. A prototype allows us to move from we think to we saw. We think users will understand this process. We saw that they got lost halfway through. We think this wording is clear. We saw that people interpreted it differently than we expected. We think this support tool is helpful. We saw that people ignored the part we thought was most useful. That shift from assumption to observation is one of the most important shifts in the whole design process. And notice something else here. The purpose of testing is not mainly approval. It is not just asking, do you like this? That question is often too weak. People may say they like something because they want to be polite, or because they see the intention behind it, or because they are imagining how it might work rather than reacting to what actually happened. So better questions are often more practical. Can you walk me through how you would use this? What would you do first? What feels unclear here? What are you expecting at this point? Where would you click? What would you do next? What part makes sense and what part makes less sense? Those questions give us something much more valuable than general approval. They give us insight into interaction. And that is what testing is really for. Testing is not a final exam. It is not a ritual before launch. It is not there to confirm that the team was right. Testing is inquiry. It is a way of learning what happens when the idea meets real use. And that means testing needs a certain mindset too. A team has to be willing to be surprised. It has to be willing to discover that the favorite idea is weaker than expected. It has to be willing to see confusion not as a user failure, but as useful information. That point is very important. If users misunderstand something, that does not necessarily mean they're careless. It may mean the design is built around assumptions that do not match how people actually think. And that is why observation matters so much in testing. Because what people do can be even more revealing than what they say. Someone may say, yes, this looks simple, and then immediately hesitate. Someone may say, that makes sense, but then choose the wrong option. Someone may tell you they would use the service, but when you watch them move through it, they become stuck, uncertain, or frustrated. That is not bad news. That is good data. In fact, one of the most useful things a prototype can do is reveal the gap between our intention and someone else's experience. We may think we have made something clear, kind, logical, or helpful, but until someone else actually uses it, we do not know. And this is true not only for digital products, but for services, processes, systems, community interventions, educational tools, and organizational changes. Imagine a team trying to help residents navigate local support services. On paper, the process may look perfectly reasonable. There is housing support, employment support, family support, language support, and health support. Each one has its entry point, its form, its contact person, and its categories. But when a resident actually tries to get help, their experience may be completely different. They may not know which category their situation belongs to. They may not think in institutional language. They may not know where to begin. They may not even see their problem as one separate issue. they may experience it as everything at once. So the team prototypes a simple support guide. And maybe the first version uses official service categories. In testing, residents become confused. They hesitate. They ask questions the team did not expect. They respond better when the guide starts from life situations rather than departments. That is a perfect example of why prototypes matter. Without the prototype, the team might have moved straight into implementation, and they would have built something clear from the institution's point of view, but confusing from the resident's point of view. With the prototype, they learn early. They see the mismatch. They improve before scaling. And that leads us to iteration. Iteration is one of the most important ideas in design thinking, and also one of the most misunderstood. Iteration means that the first version is not the final answer. It means we build, test, learn, revise, and test again. Not because we are lost, not because we failed, but because this is how better solutions emerge in uncertain contexts. A lot of traditional environments treat revision as a sign that something went wrong. If you have to go back and change something, that can feel inefficient or embarrassing. But design thinking treats revision differently. Revision is not necessarily a sign of weakness. It is often a sign that learning is happening. And that is a major mindset shift. Because the goal is not to prove that we were right at the beginning. The goal is to improve the design. And sometimes the most important thing we learn from testing is not how to improve the prototype, but how to rethink the problem. That is worth pausing on. A prototype does not only test solutions. It can test understanding. It can reveal that the team misunderstood the need, that the categories are wrong, that the sequence is wrong, that the wording is wrong, that the concept makes sense in theory, but not in practice. So iteration is not only about making a better version of the same thing. Sometimes it is about realizing that a more fundamental change is needed. That is why good iteration is thoughtful. The team should ask, what exactly did we learn? What assumption did this test challenge? What pattern did we notice? What should change now? What still feels uncertain? Without those questions, iteration can become random. The team keeps changing things, but without a clear learning direction. With those questions, iteration becomes disciplined. It becomes a process of reducing uncertainty step by step. And that is really the larger lesson of this whole episode. Prototype, test, and iterate is not just a design technique. It is a way of working under uncertainty. It is a way of being honest about what we do not yet know. It is a way of learning before it becomes too expensive not to learn. And in that sense, prototypes matter more than perfect plans because perfect plans often exist only in imagination. A plan can look complete and still be wrong. A prototype can look incomplete and still teach us something essential. That is the paradox. What looks unfinished may be more useful than what looks polished. What feels rough may be more honest. What seems temporary may create the insight that makes the final solution stronger. So if you are working on a service, a system, a community intervention, a support process, an educational tool, or any kind of human-centered solution, there is a very good question to ask yourself. What are we assuming right now that we could test instead? That is often the turning point, because the moment you ask that question, the work changes. You stop trying to protect the idea. You start trying to learn from it. You stop treating uncertainty as something embarrassing. You start treating it as something to explore. And when that happens, design becomes much more alive, much more grounded, much more connected to reality, and much more likely to produce something that people can actually use, understand, and benefit from. So as we close this episode, I want to leave you with one core thought. The purpose of an early idea is not to be impressive, it is to be testable. Because when an idea becomes testable, it becomes learnable. And when it becomes learnable, it becomes improvable. That is the real power of prototypes. They do not just help us build things, they help us think better, sooner. In the next part, we're going to go deeper into the different kinds of prototypes teams can use, how to choose the right kind for the right question, and how to run tests in a way that generates useful evidence rather than vague reactions. Because once you understand how to prototype well, you start to see that testing is not the end of design. It is one of the main ways design gets better. Thank you for listening.